regulators and governments have learned a lot over the last 10, 20 years. I mean, from this general subsidy feed-in type support to more intelligent systems that are subsidies, obviously, but still involve a high degree of competition like CFDs and auctions, and these elements of making sure the production profile during the day is incentivized to meet high prices and so forth.
Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm John Feddersen, co-founder and chief executive of Aurora. And my guest on the show today is responsible for developing a pan-European renewables portfolio spanning solar and wind for one of Europe's leading utilities. Before this, he ran one of Europe's largest power trading and origination teams. He started his electricity sector career in Enron's European teams in Frankfurt and London over 20 years ago. He's an industrial engineer by training, among other things. My guest on the show today is Stefan-Jörg Göbel, Senior Vice President, Wind and Solar Continental at Statkraft. Welcome, Stefan.
Thanks a lot, John.
Wonderful. And thanks for making the time to discuss all things renewables development and trading, among other things. But before we get to that, I'm keen to hear a little bit about your journey to where you are now. And one thing that jumps out at me was your time at Enron. And of course, Enron had a pretty prominent business in Europe around about the turn of the century. What are your fondest memories of your time at Enron?
I think it was just a very, very exciting experience. Both the steep learning curve in the business, but also living and working in London. I mean, I remember I went into the Enron garage in Grosvenor Place, and I came by bike. So parking my bike next to all the Aston Martins and Ferraris, which were owned by metals traders, not electricity traders, mind you, metals traders. And that was a good start into the morning. And then, I mean, coming up into the trading floor and this buzz, this activity, the incredible amount of smart people, I think this is really a good memory in general. And then, of course, there are some disappointments later on.
And it does feel, I mean, you do bump into Enron, to me at least, I don't know if it's your sense, but sort of Enron people from that era then went on to stay in electricity and actually do some fairly prominent things in Europe is my sense, and as well as in the US, obviously. Do you think Enron had an impact in Europe? So, this is much earlier in terms of the privatization journey. And I think one of my recent guests on the show said, to some extent, what happened in California around that time actually set back the cause of privatization in some ways. It sort of reduced the public's trust in markets. Was one of the impacts of Enron in the US. Do you think did Enron leave a legacy in those early days of liberalization of markets?
Mainly a positive legacy. I mean, it is, first of all, the number of people who were trained in that generation within Enron or via trading with Enron that really kickstart the market in the early 2000s.
Absolutely.
And certainly Enron's mindset shaped the markets. And I think the model was so successful that it couldn't even be broken by Enron's bankruptcy. I think even Enron's bankruptcy proved that trading could survive the worst case scenario. I mean, after Enron and all its physical trading vanished overnight, still the lights didn't go out. So the whole system was very robust. And I mean, it still made sense. It still fundamentally made sense. And Enron helped starting it, definitely.
There's a really nice segue to a few questions I wanted to ask you about power trading. So do you think on the sort of the physical trading point, do you think power traders need to own assets? And I just as well, first context for everyone who's listening is Stefan stopped being a power trader 3 years ago. So, the world moves fast and it may have changed a bit since then. I suppose the context, Stefan, from my perspective, it looks like, there are a bunch of banks that were involved in power trading maybe 5 years ago, maybe 7 years ago that aren't there. And there's been a movement towards, if you're going to trade power, you need to know when the power stations are being turned on and off, and owning the assets is a good way to do that. What's your perspective on asset ownership for power traders?
I think it certainly helps. First of all, if you own a significant amount of power assets, you're more or less forced to trade. So you're forced also to become an expert. I mean, it's a bit more distant for banks and other players, and it doesn't scale so very well across the globe. I mean, the principle is the same, I guess, across the globe, but the nitty-gritty details of local regulation and grid codes, etc., they change from market to market. So it's certainly significantly more complicated and localized than trading, say, oil or metals. And also the volume per market is smaller. And that's why I guess you see so many physical players and asset owners as power traders.
Just small segue there. Until recently, I don't think there really were there weren't market forces driving international generation and trading businesses, right? You tend, there are a lot of national champions. You can see them in all sorts of markets. But the phenomenon of the last 3 years of international utilities, Iberdrolas, the NLs, the Orsteds, the RWEs that are operating in dozens of markets fairly deeply. Is this and if you're right, and economies of scale in trading aren't there, what do you think has changed that enables utilities to be international now, whereas in the past they weren't necessarily?
Well, I would say the approach to internationalization is very different in RWE versus, say, Ørsted and Enel. I mean, RWE clearly takes a very regional approach, and that makes sense. I mean, they seem to select their markets very carefully, acknowledging that they can't be on top of things everywhere. They really seem to pick markets. And I would say somebody like Iberdrola picks the markets more from a project development perspective. So where does a solar wind asset really have most value? And they don't seem to trade so much. They don't seem to take so much risk on their own books when it comes to commodities, but rather spin that out in PPAs or so. So I think it's a very differentiated view on internationalization.
And just to dig a little bit deeper, and that makes total sense to me, is there a different, I suppose with renewables, trading is, as you say, there's less of a focus on, optimizing the asset in real time. It's more about signing a long-term contract. It's about proficiency in development, operation, capital, cost of capital, for example. Is it just that renewables is a more naturally scalable business than thermal generation?
Yeah, probably. And one of the main reasons is that you can engage in individual parts of the value chain much better. So it's much easier or possible to mix and match different parts of the value chain. I mean, in traditional power, take these super large traditional assets like coal-fired power stations. You normally saw people developing them, constructing them, and operating it and owning them over 50 years. You don't see that in renewables. You can choose to develop and then sell. You can choose to buy a developed asset. You can operate it for 5 years. You can own it. You can outsource the operation. We can really manage your portfolio very well, and that lets you scale in specific parts of the value chain without necessarily providing all the capital and taking all the risk. So in a way, yes.
Interesting. Yeah. You own the mine. It's a different game. Interesting. The other question I had on power trading is around the role of algorithms. So my very simplistic take on this is algorithms seem very prominent in stock markets, financial markets, equities, these types of things. But it's not clear to me that they're kind of realize their potential, that they're widely deployed, trading without human intervention in power markets. How big do you see the role for algorithms in trading power, say 5 years from now?
Maybe I rewind 5 years and would say that's when we saw algorithms first appearing in execution. When you manage a real-time portfolio of renewables, where you have to go with the weather second by second, then it's impossible to execute with only human intervention. And you try to bring the human into a controlling function over the algorithm. And that will become more and more efficient and better and faster and more robust, etc., etc. When you talk about financial markets, forward markets, I think we will definitely also see more algorithms. I think they're simply spilling over from equity markets. I would say that maybe because equity markets are so much larger, that's where it was initially most attractive to deploy algorithms. Now they're available, so you can almost copy paste them into commodities, of course, with applying all the market knowledge that you still need to have to rightfully use them. But yeah, we will see more algorithms over time.
A natural question with that is, who will own the algorithms? Does it become a proprietary piece of a trading team's arsenal? Is it the case that any algorithm that's available to everyone is worthless in a sense, and that actually it's you need to develop it in-house? Or how do you see the evolution of the ownership of algorithms and the value that they create?
Now you really have me. I don't think I'm an expert on that. But my completely layman's opinion would be that I think the algorithms and the machine learning and artificial intelligence background is obviously available in the market or in academia, and just computer chips have become so efficient that you can use stuff that has been mathematically designed 20 years ago now easily. But it's still tricky to apply them in the right way and to embed them in your risk management system, in making sure you don't fool yourself, that you don't create deadlock situations in your algorithms or catastrophes like we have seen in this flash crashes. So I think it's more like mastering the readily available algorithms, which would be the proprietary capability that you want to have.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. And congratulations on admitting that you weren't the expert on that as well. Doesn't always happen, so very refreshing. Certainly, I've occasionally claimed to be an expert in something that I'm not quite. So that's very good. Okay, can we shift on from trading to talking about the role of route to market providers and PPAs in general? So this is kind of with your new renewables development operation hat on. First question on this is about the role of government. Obviously, government has played a major role in getting renewables deployment to where it is in Europe. There were FITs that tended to absorb all of the risk for government consumers. Then we had contracts for difference, and then we've had all sorts of flavors of contracts for difference that punish negative prices or capture price differentials across locations, all of that. Do you see government contracts playing an increasing or decreasing role in generation investment over the next decade in Europe?
I think this whole world will find a balance between government support and market forces. Now, if you look at, for example, the Nordic, you have seen for a long time market forces driving renewable build out. So why would the government have a role there? Look at Spain. You see a lot of renewables coming into the market via PPAs and market prices. Still, the Spanish government has just now announced auctions to make sure they really see the volumes they want. And I believe if they find those auctions successful, they will do more. But if they see market forces as sufficient, I think they will do less. So I think it's a mix, and governments will also a little bit play with this instrument depending on if they see markets fulfilling their political targets or not. So it's not a straight one-way answer.
And so, in a sense, what you're saying is, if the costs are coming down or the technology is improving, government will step back, and if that's not the case, they'll step forward, as you see it.
I think so.
Yeah. I talked a bit about variations on government intervention, and as I said, my take, at least over the last decade, was, the very earliest schemes, the sort of feed-in tariff type things, the consumer, the government was absorbing all of the risk, and we've slowly developed instruments. CFDs are an example. I talked about negative prices. I talked about in France how you get rewarded for building in places where there aren't, where you're generating higher value power. Do you see a trend towards government intervention to support renewables that sort of avoids some of those, puts more of the risk back onto the developer in general? Or, in a sense, just, punishes economic bads and rewards economic goods, higher valued power, those sorts of things?
Yeah, absolutely. I think regulators and governments have learned a lot over the last 10, 20 years. From this general subsidy feed-in type support to more intelligent systems that are subsidies, obviously, but still involve a high degree of competition, like CFDs and auctions, and these elements of making sure the production profile during the day is incentivized to meet high prices and so forth. So yes, absolutely. I think the governments have learned a lot.
And it's interesting, it's sort of, if you take it to its, I think, and maybe I'm being an economic purist here, but sort of, if you take that evolution to its ultimate end, I think you probably end up with a carbon price, but basically is my sense. Do you see us getting, in the sense that it's targeting purely what you want, with none of the other potential distortions in certain circumstances? Do you ever see us getting to that? Do you ever see us getting to that world in Europe where the carbon price is doing the vast majority of the heavy lifting in power market decarbonisation?
Well, for many years, I at least was of the opinion that that should be the case. So that was my normative self. Today, my empirical self tells me, well, actually, people haven't believed in carbon prices driving this change, and they just want, so to speak, a simpler model, which is obviously creating paradoxons and inconsistencies and all of that, which obviously is very clear and has been very clear in Germany for so many years, where the feed-in tariff avoided CO2 at a very, very high cost. No, I don't think that we will see a world where the carbon price alone will be accepted as the ultimate weapon. Yeah, I think it's too purist indeed. People want a more tangible instrument to use in the political debate. Yeah. No, that makes sense. And the public, I think, they do get impatient on speed of, it's not enough to say, well, the carbon price will rise in the future and investment will come. I think there's an element of a desire by politicians to make sure we're deploying renewables, we're decarbonising the economy at a certain pace. Exactly. And then you do definitely see that once you have a well-designed CFD scheme, you drive down the cost of capital quite a bit, which maybe that shouldn't happen because the government is a bad advisor when it comes to
the risk doesn't disappear, but yeah,
perfect equilibrium. but it's at least a fact that sometimes markets become very uncomfortable with the long-term equilibrium. And of course, once we have, say, 100,000 megawatts of renewables in Spain, there will in fact be many hours with a marginal price of zero. Even if the carbon price is very high, the carbon price simply doesn't play a role anymore. So this extreme end point is certainly also making some people very cautious, even though I know there are instruments, of course, to counterbalance that. But the fact is the CFD, or previously feed-in tariffs, are an instrument that are simple, and they have an enormous force in driving renewables.
So who is, and that, I suppose it relates to a follow-up question I have on that, which is, and maybe you've already answered this one, but I'll ask it anyway. Who do you think in the market is best placed to manage risk from generation portfolios, not necessarily renewables? So sort of, there's a version which is government or consumers, and they just say, right, we're going to do CFDs, drive down the cost of capital by absorbing all of the risk. There are, we've talked about traders, we've talked about PPAs in Spain and in Iberia, and consumer brands absorbing that power risk in some cases. Who do you think is best placed to manage generation risk?
Definitely the market. There's no doubt about it. I mean, in terms of most efficient resource allocation, the market is best placed. And in that context, a system which would be driven only by CO2 prices would be the most efficient thing we could have. But, well, again, empirical evidence shows that this is not what people prefer, maybe understand. And it's obviously efficiency is not the only measure. There is also the wish for a certain short-term impact, visible impact in megawatt build-out, which is not exactly the same thing as CO2 abatement efficiency.
Yeah, there is a bit of a parallel in some ways, I think, to the capacity market debate as well, where, in theory, and I've talked about this topic before on the podcast, in theory, the energy only market will deliver security of supply, or the optimal amount of the lights going out. In practice, voters get very nervous about capacity adequacy, and they just want a guarantee, and that's why I think we see, and I see it increasing. Even in the markets that resisted liberalization, resisted capacity mechanisms, had high price caps in the wholesale market, like Australia, like Texas. There's still that, like Germany, I suppose, to an extent, the debate around security of supply and capacity mechanisms just never seems to go away, no matter how many times you have it. It seems like, to me at least.
No, absolutely correct, and that's where I think our industry should become a little bit better in communicating and understanding also, from our perspective, irrational arguments that still matter a lot in the political and public perception. Yeah.
So the rational arguments for energy-only markets.
Yeah, I mean, those are simply not very easy to explain. No. We should be better in explaining them, but we also need to understand the counter-arguments that might not seem rational to us, but still, in the political debate, have a lot of force.
Exactly. Politician gets up and says our policy is to have 3 hours of lost load because that's the economically efficient answer. You're not going to be winning many votes with that statement. In general, 0 is the only acceptable answer there. Yeah.
And I mean,
but economically, it's a horrible answer.
Yeah.
Very good. Just one more point on the sort of risk and role of route to market providers. What do you think hydrogen does? I know this is a long way in the future and no one can possibly know the answer to this, but is there how do you think hydrogen, and you've got a cost of producing it, it's suddenly your combustible material with a high marginal cost. What do you think the rollout of hydrogen, if it comes, green hydrogen in particular, does to power markets? Does it enable them to liberalize more? Does it enable government to step back a bit?
at least hydrogen and the abilities to store electricity indirectly would absolutely revolutionize the way power economics work, because your hourly price formation just falls away. That's of course what you see in all markets with massive storage volume like the Nordics. Your hourly profile becomes less relevant. So yes, I mean, that would be a revolution. Would it make the market more competitive? I would say in general, probably, because you just have another player, another element, which needs to be optimized, and that it does make sense to use market forces to shape that balance.
Yeah. And I suppose to some extent it depends on whether electrolyzers are a scale game or not. You could potentially as a monopolist in electrolysis, but I think there's probably too far away to have a strong view on that.
It is, of course, a fascinating scenario to think through. And obviously then people will also, people do trade hydrogen today, but then it would be a much larger scale, and combustible fuels and electricity would grow even closer together and would be more directly linked. National boundaries for price formation and power would break. I mean, it is really a fascinating thought experiment, and clearly also why many power companies are looking at hydrogen. I guess we all have the feeling as power companies that hydrogen would change the fundamentals of our industry.
Yeah, indeed. And from the Aurora perspective, that's partly why it's so. It is, in as much as anything is, it's modelable. I think, and you can draw inference from certain models. Could I ask a bit closer to home and a bit closer to your business? So you're focused on both wind and solar. That's not necessarily always the business model people adopt. They specialize in solar, they specialize in wind, they specialize in offshore wind. Why have you chosen to combine the two at Statkraft?
Yeah, we believe that being in a market, we would like to deliver to the market what the market needs. And in some places that might be wind, in some places that might be more solar, and in some places that might be more trading solutions. And we believe the local relations do scale. So, and also the local project development skills do scale between the two technologies. So once you understand how permitting works, you can apply it either to wind or solar. And that's one thing. But also on the engineering side, just this flow of a project through engineering into construction, the business case modeling and so forth, that is very much comparable. And that's why we think, or also have made the experience, that doing wind and solar in one portfolio provides a lot of advantages.
And even more specifically, so in terms of acquisition, you've recently had a reasonably large acquisition, Solar Century.
Yeah.
How do you think about acquisition versus organic growth? Like, at what point, what's the trigger for saying, right, let's acquire an existing business rather than develop it ourselves?
Yeah. I mean, earlier you introduced myself as somebody who's trying to build a pan-European business. And that is only true to some extent, because we already had a business in Northern Europe and in the UK and Ireland, which is not part of my responsibility. So I'm trying to build something in continental Europe.
Yeah.
And in continental Europe, our wind and solar activity was close to zero. So say 10 years behind most of our peers. This is a typical textbook example for trying an acquisition. And we have tried and looked at many, many targets for 2 years. And because we were not successful with many of our approaches earlier, we have also built up organic teams, or we've organically built up teams in a number of markets. And now, finally, 2.5 years after having established our growth strategy in wind and solar, we have been successful in acquiring Solar Century, which is definitely giving us a massive boost in achieving our strategic targets to be in solar across Europe.
Okay, kickstarts a lot of what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And in this case, it is about a platform, having project development teams, having the process, having the IT systems to run a project through its development process, having an engineering team, having a construction team, having the relationships into the market, both locally and into the investor market. This totality is taking a long time to build, and with an acquisition, you get it basically in one package, and that's what we. That's why we did it.
Yeah. Okay. One final question on Statkraft and what you're doing there. So it's a government-owned utility. There are still some left in Europe, not a huge amount. It's not the norm. Government have stakes in certainly a few. How does that? Where do you see the biggest benefits there? And just I suppose one piece of recent theme has been, can big oil and gas do power? And I think the argument recently from Laurie Fitch was Dong couldn't have become Ørsted without the cocoon of government, and that BP and Shell will have a challenging situation there. I mean, you're already in power. Where do you see the virtues of government ownership at the moment?
Now, first of all, it is necessary to describe our government ownership as a precondition or a function or result of doing hydropower. We're still, if you look at our balance sheet, dominated by hydropower.
Yeah.
And that is state-owned, and that is the norm across the globe, actually. If you in most countries, governments do own hydropower. States own hydropower. It is a little bit of a emotional attachment. People see it as natural resources, and they want to have it managed differently from other resources. And there is this massive political debate in France, for example, about how to manage hydropower, and it is much more contentious than privatizing other things. So that's the historical and almost cultural background for public ownership of Statkraft. Now, I think, of course, one of the benefits is our creditworthiness, our stability, our alignment between public interests and our business interests. Those are all benefits. When it comes to the competitiveness of oil and gas and the ability to go into renewables, I believe should be quite difficult for oil and gas to move into renewables, because the project size is much smaller. The mindset is much different. The brand and people's interaction with your asset and with your role is very different. The markets are very different. Coming back to your initial question, in oil, you are basically producing into a global market. In power, you're sometimes producing into a very, very local market. But I think the shift for anybody coming from a different industry into renewables or into power is rather strong.
Okay.
I'm sure I answered your question fully. There might be some elements that I have for now declined to answer. I'm not sure.
No, that was a helpful summary. So it sounds like, and without putting, at least my interpretation on that is, you think it'll be very difficult for some of these oil and gas majors. Do you think renewables are smaller scale? So do you think Ørsted, and I think they've succeeded. I think it's fair to say they've spectacularly succeeded. Do you think they succeeded because they went into offshore wind rather than? So it was about the skill. So that arguably would be one area in which the skill set is not dissimilar.
Correct. Offshore wind is the one thing that is relatively close or closer to oil and gas than onshore wind and solar. Size of the asset, complexity, barriers to entry, government relations, and what have you. I think there is a lot of similarities between oil and gas and offshore, at least more than elsewhere. But even in offshore, I mean, we have done a few projects around the UK in offshore, and my personal perception maybe was that, and we had a joint venture with, at that time, Statoil, and they were able to really fix any problem, but sometimes they overestimated the available budget, because in order to have much larger resources available to deliver your project. And still in electricity, margins are slimmer.
Yeah, interesting. So do you think it's a legitimate question to ask who will be the Ørsted of CCUS, for example? Is that the sort of thing that has I suppose, assuming you believe CCUS will work at scale and everywhere, do you think that's a reasonable question to say, who will be the Ørsted of that in the oil and gas space?
You mean carbon capture and storage?
Carbon capture, use and sequestration.
I don't have a view on that.
Okay.
Pass, please.
Okay, good. It's a sign that I've asked you enough difficult questions that we've got to the point of passing. That's probably not a bad point to move to the final section of questions, which I do every podcast. I ask you whether certain concepts are underrated or overrated, just as the way of, because anyone can say something's good or bad, but then the natural question is, well, relative to what, in a sense. So underrated, overrated is meant to tease out your view relative to the rest of the industry. So I'll give you a bunch of concepts, and if feel free to tell me if they're underrated or overrated and why. So the first concept is solar's role in decarbonizing the economy. We hear it's the cheapest source of renewables. It's done great things over the last few years, but obviously it only produces power at certain times and in certain places. Do you think solar's role in decarbonizing the economy is overrated or underrated?
Underrated.
Okay. And could I ask, what do you think people are getting wrong about solar then if it's underrated?
I believe that it's the sheer size of that development, the amount of energy and the amount of change that solar has kicked off is not seen by the general public, and probably not even by the experts. Prices are going down so steeply still, and they're following partly classical industrial learning curves and price digression, but even exceeding those price decreases. It's really crazy. Who would have thought 5 years ago that we would see auctions delivering a kilowatt hour or a megawatt hour rather at 15 euros per megawatt hour? This is just still crazy. If we would have sat down 5-10 years ago, and one of us would have said 15 euros per megawatt hour for solar? No, this is indeed the cheapest source of energy. And now we do see the tipping points for bringing batteries and hydrogen into the game. And then this whole intermittency question goes away. And of course, in some markets, like maybe Spain, anywhere near the equator, a battery with a couple of hours storage maybe is enough to do the trick. So technologically, this is done. It's only a matter of, can we fix the economics? Will the price decrease quickly enough, and so forth? And that is, of course, why also oil and gas companies look into, especially solar, because they can see the market share of fossil fuels declining in the primary energy markets.
Yeah. And even, you talked about 5 or 10 years ago. I think you're right. And I think this is maybe a phenomenon even of the last 6 months. The numbers we're seeing, people say 15 euros. I think people still say, when you see 15 euros in Spain, in Portugal, those, when you're getting sort of 20 to 25% load factors, people say, that must be a fluke. So they must have had some sort of cheap government funding. They must have had. I think in a sense that sort of people don't quite know where the market is at the moment either. In many ways. So, yeah, very, very, very interesting. Okay, the second concept is power markets, and I'm talking about the markets' role during the energy transition to net zero. Do you think the role of markets is overrated or underrated?
I think it's underrated. It has been notoriously difficult to explain power markets. Have you tried to explain power markets to your mom and dad, your
Grandmama.
parents, your sisters. It is so difficult to explain how you can economically balance something that is physically real time. And at the same time, we've seen the merits of power trading and resource optimization over the last 20 years, and has spared the economy and the environment billions of euros and millions of tons of CO2 by making sure we use resources efficiently. It is still underestimated.
Yeah, certainly one stylized fact of the last few decades is governments were not very good at optimizing the assets they had in general in most parts of the world.
Of course, say in Germany, the government didn't own the assets at all. They had utilities that were regulated and had a guaranteed return, and there was simply zero incentive to do anything efficiently. In hindsight, really crazy.
And yet we still have hundreds of municipal utilities in Germany.
They're now embedded into a market and they need to compete with that market. At least on the generation side, I'd say this is very, very efficient now in most parts of Europe.
Agree with that, particularly on the generation side. Okay, the final concept is, we talked about this one as well, but good to hear whether you think they're overrated or underrated. So international utilities that operate in, say, a dozen or more countries, do you think they're overrated or underrated?
I don't know if people really rate them.
I think the stock market rates them.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. That's a good one. I wouldn't know because I haven't looked at valuations, at least not recently. I can see at least the logic for placing high multiples on international utilities, because this is something that we haven't managed for the last 20 years, trying to scale internationally. Again, because markets are still very local in electricity. It's been very difficult to build international scale. So if you manage to find a particular role in the value chain that does scale, I can see why this is receiving high multiples.
Yeah.
And then, especially in the case of Iberdrola and EDPR and Enel, also because it's simply a growth factor, the renewables part, and they have apparently hit the sweet spot.
It's an interesting, the logic of it's $1 trillion, it's trillions that are going to be deployed. If you can find the scalable part of the value chain, you will be very valuable. I think one of the open questions for me, at least, is, particularly in offshore wind, there was certainly a first move, those who, the evangelists who thought this was the future and then, relatively cost effectively were able to claim, gigawatts of development capacity. They've done very well. The question will be, for the next gigawatts, does that bit scale as well? You could buy, there's a land grab. Some people grab lots of land, but when we go to the next 10 gigawatts in the US or the next 10 gigawatts in Taiwan or wherever it is, is that the scalable part of the business as well? I think, is that a scalable part of the sector? I think is a very interesting question.
I think this is a very interesting one, and that will drive a lot of strategic discussions in the years to come. What is the balance between your geographical scope or your technology scope and your role in the value chain? Because I believe geography does play a role. You do need to understand the individual market. You can't just hop from market to market. Well, you can do that, but then at some point this is it. We are in a steep growth now, and we will be in steep growth for a few more years. But at some point, things will balance and be a bit more, a bit less hot. And then it's still important to have an interesting role. And then you need also a bit more equilibrium in your portfolio, not only running from one development to the next.
Excellent. Well, that's a natural time to finish, Stefan. Thank you very much for sharing your unique perspective as a trader and now as a renewables developer. Stefan Göbel, best of luck as you continue to build your renewable portfolio and drive the energy transition forward. And thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me.
Thank you very much, John.
That was John Feddersen, Aurora's co-founder and chief executive, talking to Stefan-Jörg Göbel, Senior Vice President, Wind and Solar Continental at Statkraft. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening and goodbye.